We've reached a point now in the history of screen comedy, that being the 1930s, which is known as the classical or golden age of Hollywood cinema. So this is more than 30 years after the beginning of cinema. And in the case of comedy, we can see that there have been a variety of different developments and ways for integrating comic events or jokes into films that more or less have culminated in feature narrative comedy films like we saw previously in The Gold Rush, which of course was initially a silent film and then a soundtrack was added in the early 1940s. But we're getting to this week a topic of a different kind of comedy that to many critics and commentators and historians, as well as people living at the time, seemed not to fit in what was supposed to be a development of comedy into a more refined form. And that's what we're going to refer to as anarchic or anarchistic comedy. And the Marx Brothers are a great example of this. And we're going to approach it more or less not as being an example of how comedy did or did not naturally evolve, but rather think about how in a historically specific time, place, people made sense of comedy because of what they were familiar with, whether it was from the world of film itself or outside of that world. So I'm going to start just by reading you a couple of quotes from some reviews of comedy films in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. Again, this is before sound film, before sync sound. The first one says, "Slapstick must be taboo. The public has gone beyond the rough and tumble performances that used to be classed as humorous. Instead, a more subtle, clean-cut production with at least some semblance of a story is the current demand in the comedy line." This is from Moving Picture World, September 1919. So Moving Picture World is a trade magazine that is aimed at the audience of actual people working in the film industry. It's trying to report on what it is that audiences want and that people working in the moving picture world ought to be interested in producing. So you're hearing here some symptomatic comments of that shift that I've previously described, where film is supposed to be made more appropriate for a middle class audience than it previously had been. And so part of that was creating nicer theaters, bigger theaters, and also different kinds of films in order to appeal to a more lucrative audience. And here we're applying that same shift really in terms of the type of comedy. Slapstick, that's for the old working class, simple people. We need something more refined. That's not so quote unquote rough and tumble. The next quote says, "The comedy producers are desirous of polite, plausible situation comedies, preferably founded upon an amusing situation that might very naturally occur in the life of almost any spectator." So this quote is loaded with a lot of stuff. The one word that really sticks out to me is probably polite. The idea of polite humor, right? What does that mean? Well, it means it's not about what we read about as the carnivalesque, right? Bodily humor is not polite. Humor that breaks taboos about good taste is not polite. But here we also have the word plausible situation comedies. That's tying it into narrative and stories. And in fact, normal day-to-day life. An amusing situation that might very naturally occur in the life of almost any spectator. Now, we might look at a film like The Gold Rush and say, well, this is not like anything anyone is going to encounter. This is about striking it rich in the Yukon. And that's true, but it's also about trying to become successful. It's about falling in love and trying to get someone's attention. On that level, there is an aspect of that film which is very much relatable and an aspect of a more or less polite style of narrative. All right, now that brings us back to this word polite again. Another term that's used to describe comedy in this vein is genteel. Genteel or polite comedy. These are terms that were used in this period of Hollywood history for what were considered plausible situation comedies, where the comedy involves story, it comes out of the situation, rather than the kind of slapstick, out of nowhere, not related to the narrative, very physical, broad comedy. So the idea with the genteel or polite is it's more refined. It's not about the body. It's not about slapstick. Instead, it's about story, about some amusing situation that might occur in the life of almost any spectator. Now, one of the recommended films I have for you, I didn't require that you watch it, but I highly recommend that you watch it, is Safety Last with Harold Lloyd. And this is a famous shot from that film, where he's hanging off the hands of a clock over the city street. Now, this is a good example here of like the particular thing that's happening to him should not occur in the life of any spectator. However, this is a film about him trying to get a job, trying to work in marketing, and becoming part of a marketing stunt that turns into this. So in that sense, it is still a kind of genteel or at least plausible situation. Okay, so if we back up for a second now, we can look and we can say, all right, up to this point, we have seen a pretty interesting trajectory of screen comedy. That is a series of developments of different kinds of very different kinds of comedy. Initially, you have that cinema of attractions, which is really just on the spectacle, whether that's comedy or not, right? So slapstick, the one joke film, that is typical of that earliest of cinema, the cinema of attractions. Then we have a shift towards more story and the genteel or the polite comedy that is a plausible situation that incorporates some kind of narrative. It's a situation that might come out of everyday life, in which there's some kind of interaction that includes comedy. And by the end of the 1920s, we have the classical narrative model really absolutely dominating not just comedy, but of course all of Hollywood. That means you've got a protagonist who wants something. They have someone that's getting in their way of that. They have all kinds of obstacles related to a chief conflict. And by the end of the film, that's resolved in some way. That's the classic narrative model, where anything that we see that takes place is a plausible series of cause and effect events, right? If we see something, it's related to what came before and has some impact on what happens later. And that goes for jokes too. That goes for funny things that happen. They're integrated into the narrative and usually have some kind of impact on that narrative development. So we've gotten to this point by the end of the 1920s, right, where we have this classical narrative model that's really dominating Hollywood. And then we get this added element of sound. So the question becomes, now how, for all filmmakers, how do you incorporate sound into the kinds of movies that you've been making? What can you do differently? How do you incorporate now, for us, new kinds of comic events, new kinds of characters, and dialogue? Because for the first time, you can have synced dialogue. Before, you would have to write, a quotation on an intertitle that the audience would see and have to read. Now you can just have people say things. So now we've got sound. How do you, as filmmakers, incorporate sound yet remain in polite or genteel comedy, remain making comedy that's in good taste? And the bottom line is that when a lot of critics saw the Marx Brothers, they thought, oh my goodness, what is going on? Okay, so if you think about this trajectory, we start out with those cinema attractions in the late 19th century into the 1900s. Then we start getting those two-reelers that are still heavily physical, slapstick comedy in the 1910s. Then by the 1920s, we really have the dominance of the classical narrative, the genteel or polite comedy. Then, 1933, we have our film Duck Soup with these four guys, the Marx Brothers, and they now have sound. So if we're looking in terms of narrative and narrative development and comic events fitting in narrative, the Marx Brothers are a wild deviation from that. Yes, there is a narrative, but the comic event, the joke, is still the most important thing. So we'll talk more about that in discussion and also maybe a little bit in the upcoming slideshows.